we're going to have a super interesting panel discussion now. And I remember back in 2020, we were like spearheading this DeFi summer back in Polygon, right? And I bought this DeFi for all ENS domain. And the ideals of DeFi was so different, right? It was about banking the unbanked. It was about financial inclusion. DeFi was all about taking DeFi to the masses, right? And now in 2024, it's become this like centralized DeFi thing where everyone's just building things for banks and DeFi for banks, and everyone's getting excited about on-chain treasuries. And I'm like, what happened to banking the unbanked, right? What happened to how we started all of this DeFi ideals on, right? And that's why I feel this panel is a perfect segue to discuss that. And we're going to discuss how funding solutions can be used for refugee aid. And to discuss this, we want to welcome this amazing set of panelists. First, we have, with more than 10 years of tremendous experience with financial policy, please welcome Anna Whitson-Diaz from the Stellar Foundation. Next, we have a real amazing person who's making localization a reality. Please welcome Melyn McKay from Coala. And we have the CPO of an amazing organization we learned a lot from in our FTC residency days. We actually had Yegor from the team. Amazing guy, I love him. So let's give it up and welcome the CPO of Refunite, who has more than 1 million users supporting refugees. Please welcome Philea Bartels from the Refunite team. And finally, to moderate this interesting panel discussion, our very own David. Please welcome David.
All right. Really excited about this panel because it brings together a lot of things that I've been passionate about for over a decade, maybe 15 years, and also the way that I got into crypto in, 2013, which was to figure out kind of last mile solutions in the global south, specifically in Central America, just figuring out how to get money into remote locations where financial infrastructure was basically absent or non-functional or ate up 50% of the money that I was sending. So yeah, I guess I first wanted to set a bit of context. At Funding the Commons, we think there is a really interesting real-world use case here using blockchain technology for refugee humanitarian aid and also empowerment and kind of local entrepreneurial empowerment and kind of getting less dependent on aid, actually. And there's a few interesting kind of use cases that I think come together. One is very basic financial inclusion, access to the financial system, which is very difficult often for refugees who are unable to pass traditional banking KYC. And that brings identity, which you heard a little bit about identity earlier today in the Mae Sot area of Thailand, where there's a lot of issues with kind of identity and documentation of immigrants. The safe storage and transport of value. So often refugees are on the move and crossing borders and fleeing conflict, and it's important that they're able to basically transport value and wealth safely and invisibly. And then lastly, a basic income and the ability to access money. So we heard also earlier today that a large number of the global population lives on $2 a day or less. And in crypto, there are actually billions of dollars a year distributed in public goods funding, retroactive public goods funding campaigns, airdrops, all sorts of things. And so once there are a number of refugees around the world that have crypto wallets, they can access a part of this funds, which I think can become some significant percentage of the total amount of refugee aid over time. So this is like some things we're excited about. And without further ado, I'll let each of the speakers introduce themselves and what they're working on. Thank you. Philea.
All right, thank you, David. So hi, I'm Philea Bartels. I'm the Chief Product Officer of Refunite. Refunite is Refugees United. It's very clear. So Refunite basically is a tech nonprofit organization, and we provide financial and also educational assistance to refugees, victims of crisis, and also remote communities, mostly in a very hard to reach areas. We already developed this organization since 2008. We managed to have 100,000 community leaders working in our network. Then they support 100 million community members. So I'm really happy to able to find David and funding the commons, because we have the community and David have the network, and we're really hoping that meeting all of these network could actually be part of our partnership and support the people that we support. So. That's it from my side.
I'm Melyn McKay. I am one of the co-founders of Coala. We work with some of the largest international nonprofits, organizations like Save the Children, like Norwegian Refugee Council, to enable them to actually be able to transact on public blockchains. So for the most part, we're focused on helping those organizations to work more efficiently and more equitably with large local organizations that are able to access more remote populations, that are going to remain sustainably in those communities, providing aid and support. And to do that in ways that doesn't put them at greater risk, because they're operating in what we would call a non-permissive environment. So someplace like Myanmar, where the military is actually monitoring financial transactions through the banking system in order to target humanitarian aid workers.
Hey guys, is this working? Oh, now, okay. Hey everybody, it's really loud, wow, okay. I'm Anna Whitson-Diaz. I work at the Stellar Development Foundation, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen my colleague Anka around, or a booth out there. But Stellar is a blockchain where we're really interested in providing equal access to the global financial system. So people that are traditionally excluded from the financial system are able to use blockchain to kind of participate. So this is a lot of what David was talking about in terms of serving the unbanked or the underbanked. So our blockchain, it's really optimized for digital payments, and that's for a lot of reasons. But sending a transaction on our blockchain basically costs 0.001 cent, I think, something like this. So you can send about 10,000, don't quote me, it's like 10 or 1,000, some amount of thousand transactions for 1 cent, right? So what this means is that we're able to really support a lot of financial inclusion use cases, and also refugee aid, aid in humanitarian settings as well. So a few years ago, we were actually approached by the UN, UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency, to help them develop a product that could use blockchain to send aid to refugees, people in displacement situations, humanitarian situations. So we've developed an open source tool to send bulk cash disbursements to refugees in need. It's a bit use case agnostic, where we have seen a lot of other interesting things happening with it. I'm sure we can get into that later, but UNHCR is currently our biggest partner in the space. We've done over $5 million of direct cash disbursements to refugees in the Ukraine crisis, and are scaling that up. We're also working with government partners, with other UN agencies, and we're really looking in the next year or so to really scale much more with organizations that are closer to the ground. So local, subnational organizations, regional organizations, rather than just kind of concentrating on the big guys. And a lot of that perspective from my side also comes from spending about a decade at UNDP, the UN Development Program. So I'm really interested in this kind of like localization angle of how we get more of these local or subnational actors into these discussions as well.
Thank you. All right, so to further set a little bit of context, Refunite partnered with Funding the Commons to run our first pilot ever in Uganda, and it's ongoing. We're working with a community around Kampala, I believe.
Yes, correct.
And we are funding a music studio, and we hope to enable a cadre of new creators to produce music that we can share the stories of refugees with the world, and invite the global community to make direct contributions and donations to support those creators. And Here in Thailand and Myanmar, we're partnered with Coala to do research around stellar off-ramps in this area, specifically for the Burmese population, and really excited to get into that and share some results as they come out over the coming months. So yeah, this first question is for you two, and it's looking at how do we move funding from the larger international NGOs more into the grassroots, where there's kind of NGOs that are closer to the ground, like Refunite, closer to the community, more efficient, less bureaucracy, less overhead, more flexible, faster to deploy. And yeah, how do we do that?
Maybe I can do like a little bit of scene setting. So within the international aid sector, there's been an agreement in place since about 2016 under something called the Grand Bargain, which was an acknowledgement of the fact that it is shameful that the vast majority of humanitarian international aid actually ends up back in the pockets of consultants in Brussels or London. And so how do we get more money to stay in communities? And one of the pieces of that solution is that what we call the localization agenda, which means working with those local organizations to be able to actually reach populations, but also more sustainably leave resources and stronger governance systems in place. One of the challenges is that the vast majority of international nonprofits are not actually structured to be fund managers, essentially. So they're being asked to manage $75 million for an education program in Pakistan, but they can't actually do direct implementation in order to meet that requirement. So they're managing complex payments to potentially quite small organizations that might not have some of the systems in place that are normally required to be able to report back to a donor about how they've managed that funding and the impact that they've had. And so it's putting a lot of pressure on these international nonprofits to essentially be program managers rather than direct implementers, and they don't always have the capacity or the experience to do that efficiently. So there's a kind of a moment right now, I would say, and I'm curious to know what you think about this, Anna, having worked in one of the agencies, where there's a lot of pressure on them. They don't have the tools to do it yet. And so, with Coala Pay, we're really focused on actually helping those large international nonprofits to be able to get that funding to those local partners in a more efficient and equitable way, so it's not as paternalistic. The challenge is then you're essentially doing change management with these very large global organizations. So there's definitely a moment of opportunity, but it's also providing large organizations with the tools that they need in a way that feels familiar to them, because they're quite change resistant. And kind of we sell it as like, we can make it easier for you to do the thing that's really hard for you to do, but you're getting a lot of pressure to do. Normally kind of coming at them and saying, we're going to change your whole system and take all the funding away from you and give it to local partners is not like the strongest way to get them on board. So you do have to do it a little bit like Trojan horse style.
Yeah, Melyn stole everything I was about to say, so thank you, Melyn, for that. Yeah, I definitely couldn't agree more. I think working at UNDP for like the better part of my career, you see this very kind of top-down narrative a lot of the time, right? So we're deciding in New York or in Geneva about what we think people need in developing countries, which is definitely not the way that development should be done. And I would say UNDP is one of the ones that kind of recognizes that, but doesn't always kind of walk the talk, right? So I think, the Grand Bargain Agreement that Melyn referenced, I think the commitment is 25%, that international donors want to send 25% of their aid down to the local level, right? Rather than routing it through organizations like UN agencies and things like that, that often are very bureaucratic and have to kind of then disperse it to a medium tier NGO and then down to the local level as well. So this is a lot of cost, bureaucratic cost and operational cost is kind of skimmed off the top. It's slow process. It's not very flexible, right? These kind of things. So I think one of the things we were actually talking about through the past couple of days participating in the design jam was the need to flip this narrative kind of on its head, right? So rather than us trying to decide, I live in New York myself, so rather than us in New York trying to decide what is needed in Sudan or what is needed in Thailand for the refugee population, we should be working more closely with local subnational organizations to decide what the needs are and to pilot things, right? In a kind of low-risk environment with small grants, small funding, where we can take that success story and we can kind of roll it up to a Save the Children or a Mercy Corps or a medium-sized NGO that can kind of incubate that, right? And help it grow and help prove it out in other locations. So I think there's some scope to explore further, and something I really want to do at Stellar, leading the aid and humanitarian portfolio next year, is like how we do more of this, right? How we incubate small projects, prove they work, take that narrative up to kind of the larger NGOs that operate more flexibly than, say, like a UN organization or some of these really, really massive international organizations. Incubate it, have a story about it, and they can help us scale it, right? Or I think that's also something that they can use to fundraise from their donors, because of course a Save the Children or a Mercy Corps, they have the same donors, right? They're hitting up philanthropic organizations, they're hitting up government donors, all of these things, and they need that narrative of what works to be able to fundraise and help scale. So I think my answer, besides everything Melyn said that she stole from me, is really just about like flipping the narrative and making sure that this is a bottom-up approach rather than top-down.
So yeah, I want to connect the bottom to the top, and talking about like how do we create and scale these small-scale pilots and bring them up to the larger organizations and get funding to kind of bring them to more people around the world. And in light of that, I wanted to ask each of you, starting with Philea, how you approach impact metrics, impact measurement, and how maybe public blockchains enable that and make it easier for you to track what's happening on the ground.
Is it working now? Yes. Yeah. So how do we measure impact? So for us, it's the combination of immediate relief impact and also the lasting change impact. I think that's the key. So we can measure from the sustainable shift of quality of life of the people that we help, also the economic stability, and lastly, how resilient the community after we help. So that's the big umbrella of how we do it. And blockchain help us a lot because we're testing in a traditional way. And usually it takes a lot of time for the funding to be received by the beneficiaries. It takes like 7 to 14 days in average. So if we handle like emergency response, people already suffering and starving, when the money reaches them. So that's one of the idea why we try to find alternative solution using blockchain. And for the past 5 years, especially during COVID, where most of the sadly, the humanitarian agencies, they had to close the offices in the remote areas, and the communities basically struggling to get their resources, because not all organizations able to also educate. So some organizations sending resources, which is already very helpful for get back to make the community get back on their feet, but how about the sustainability strategy, right? So that's one of the blockchain support that we're trying to get. We tested with, for example, Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is the easiest that we can find at that moment. We have a lot of agents on the ground that can cash out. So if someone send to whatever Bitcoin wallet, like a wallet of Satoshi or Moon, or they heavily used in Africa, because our main area to support is Africa. And Bitcoin works. Ethereum also we tested, and we want to test more with finding the commons. And I'm very curious about Stellar, because philosophically speaking, Stellar is really matched with what we do. So yeah, we tested a lot with blockchain. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, similar metrics in terms of efficiency, I guess, are the primary things we're looking at. For instance, we were running a program with Norwegian Refugee Council into Sudan, supporting local Sudanese organizations. So we were looking at everything from the amount of time saved and actually getting funding from Oslo down on the ground in a context that has an enormous cash and liquidity crisis. So we were looking both at the time saved and also on the amount saved. So in total, we were able to save on that program more than 20% on those transactions.
That's crazy.
It's a crazy amount, but it was also not even the most important piece, because we asked them, can you tell us how long it would normally take you to get money from Oslo down onto the ground in any of these areas into Darfur? And they said, we would tell you, but we've never successfully done it. So yeah, and also, again, when we talk about these large aid organizations and where their costs come, some of those overheads are spent on things like having someone sat to determine how and when a transaction happened. So we worked out with one of our INGO users that just by having a kind of timestamp on a transaction, we're saving them 30 minutes of somebody's time that would otherwise take a manual solution to identify when that transaction happened. So I think it's a place where the metrics actually almost sometimes feel to people like they're overly simplified, but it's because it is such an important sort of improvement over very manual, very like sort of slow systems that are currently in place. So it doesn't always have to be that, in our program, we're serving 33,000 people and things like that in Sudan. But actually it's like those little tiny efficiency gains are the things that are going to make those large INGOs and the agencies and their donors ultimately adopt the technology, because that's the piece that they're really focused on.
Okay, Melyn, stop stealing everything. Thank you again. But I couldn't agree more. I think I come very much from the traditional development financing space, so the traditional way that donors, especially governments, are giving money, right? And what they're really concerned about is transaction costs. They're concerned about transparency because, of course, they need to report to their donors back home, their taxpayers, right? So I think a lot of this is very relevant still in the blockchain space, right? Like they want to do it faster, cheaper, better. And I think what we've tended to do in this space in the past that hasn't been successful is just replicate fiat systems, right? Because blockchain is a fancy new toy that everyone's interested in, right? Not even that new anymore, but in the UN space, when things are 30 years behind, it's very new for them. So I think we need to find use cases where we can demonstrate that it is faster, cheaper, better, more transparent, all of these things, right? Rather than just replicating the fiat systems that already exist. Because when we do that, it's not always readily apparent that the time and effort to set up these systems was worth it. That we've seen that in the past, right? Maybe it wasn't worth it. It was a lot of work to set up, and really the results didn't bear out that this was something that was substantially better, right? So we've seen that happen in pilot we did with IRC in Ukraine. They kind of were listen, this is a great solution, but it's not that much better than what we do with fiat, right? So I think what we need to do is actually find these cases where we can demonstrate that there was a need to use crypto. And an example I could give is some work that we've just done with GIZ, which is the German government. So we're working with them in northwest Syria. So for obvious reasons, it's really difficult to work in Syria, to move money across borders because of sanctions, because of all the liquidity issues, all of these things, right? So the German government supports an NGO in Syria that's a hospital complex, right? So they have 1,000 people in this hospital complex that they need to make payroll to every month, right? So this is doctors and surgeons and drivers and cleaning staff and everyone in the hospital system. And when they were using fiat systems, they were waiting 3 to 4 months for each payroll period to get money into the country. So what was happening in practice was that you get hired, you get your first paycheck 4 months later, right? Because they were using the Turkish post to move fiat currency into the country. Likewise, it was really difficult to actually cash the money out. So when they would go to a liquidity point, they would have to go on average 9 times every month to actually get their money out, right? So they could never really tell if there was going to be money there on the day, so they would just kind of have to go. And what ended up happening was that it also becomes unsafe at that point, right? Because then I say, oh, hey, Melyn, hey, David, hey, I'll go pick up money for all of us, right? And then I'm walking around with a ton of cash, which is also not ideal in many situations where there's conflict and fragility. So by using our technology, partnering with Stellar, they were able to basically send digital currency directly to people's cell phones. So they're instant payments in USDC in stablecoin. And then we were able to hook them up with an off-ramp partner called DigiBank, which is a wallet that operates in the region, who has a network of Coala partners. So these are traditional liquidity point partners. And they could see in their app, right? Is there money in this Coala the day I want to go? And honestly, I've said this, Melyn and I are on a world tour. We've spoken on 4 panels in the last 3 weeks together. So she's heard this, but honestly, one of the people from the CSO network or the NGO network that we were working with that has to deal with these payments a lot, literally said when he pressed the button to send the payments to people's cell phone that he had a tear in his eye, because he was for me, having to deal with this every month, it's a nightmare. So yay for me, but also yay for the people who no longer have to go 9 times to a liquidity point every month to get their payroll, their salary, or they don't have to wait 4 months for their first paycheck. So like it's really revolutionary in some of these cases where moving money cross-border is like near impossible with fiat systems. So that was a really long answer, but I think, yeah, demonstrating where we can use crypto in cases that like improve the speed, improve the transparency on the public blockchain, improve the efficiency, and really serve a need that we can't with fiat. I think that's really like where we need to be demonstrating value.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. Is my mic working? No. Okay, I'll just speak really loudly. So final question coming from, starting from the ground and going up the chain. I want to talk and hear a little bit from each of you on how you each do due diligence on projects, like looking at like what are the blockers for once we identify these real use cases for using public blockchains to distribute aid. How do we scale them? What are the blockers? What are the fears of the larger funders? What is their risk tolerance? How do we educate them on like overcoming perceived risks? How do we shift from the current solutions where you've heard sometimes it takes 20%, I've heard numbers like 40% of the funds are often eating up by banking fees, transaction fees, I don't know, like armed security escorts, like all sorts of things that you have to use to get money to the last mile. And really like intermediaries, like how do we eliminate intermediaries and get the funds to where they actually have the highest impact, and yeah, really like how do we unblock what is preventing us from scaling these solutions? And I love to hear more about your like multi-sig solution where there's like a transparent view from all the funders and the beneficiaries.
That's the bomb. So I think to build the trust when we send support is really key here. So the way we educate the community is we're not just sending money directly. It's our first assessment. We need to know that the community actually able to implement the project, because for example, if they request for, I want to build a water system from the river to the village, it takes, 10 kilometers. And I'm not just going to send the money directly to them. We're going to ask, are you able to build it? And that's the key, right? To be able to, if you ask for $10,000 to build this, are you able to build it? And that's part of the due diligence, to able to list down what are you gonna do. So it's part of our proposal to be very, very specific on the plan. And once the proposal already well built, we put the donors, Refunite, and the community leaders, including all the actors that will receive the money, into a multi-sig group. And we use some of the Web3 tools as well. Our partner, Philea, is a community, they call it community super app. It's really helpful for us to congregate this actor inside the multi-sig. And the donor can approve the transaction that requested by the community. So that's the key. So let's say I want to ask for $10,000 to build a water well, and Refunite asking for the donors, hey, there would be a request, and you want to approve or not. Here's the proposal. And everyone can witness in that multi-sig group. It's not public, but and it's also it's quite private because it's very close loop. But everyone that really need to witness the transaction is there, basically. So that's part of the due diligence. And also, when the project already implemented, we call it peer reviewer. So that's also key, because when we work with community, we need to know if they're trustworthy or not. So we're kind of like sending the other community leaders that live in the proximity of that area to go like in a stealth mode, asking the community members that, hey, is this leader actually implementing what they're supposed to do? And we're not telling the leaders at all, so we're like on the back asking questions. So that really worked. That really worked.
Undercover.
Yeah, undercover. Yes. Yeah, so that's part of the due diligence.
Yeah, so we basically mirror the large INGO's due diligence processes. So we kind of digitize what they would normally do through a series of like 46 emails to a poor, beleaguered local partner that's operating in a conflict zone. We take that process and we streamline it, so they only have to kind of put it all together for us. And then we provide like essentially a secure data room where they have control over who gets to actually see the documents that they put together. So a donor has to request to view that. So there is that sort of mutual consent piece, which is really important for us. That includes something like a traditional KYC for organizations of the kind of top 3 people within that organization who have fiduciary duties. It also includes a liveness check in contexts where we're a little bit concerned about AI-generated teams, which is a problem that happened in Ukraine. But we also are doing a more traditional sort of organizational capacity assessment, and we are not the ones that are sort of deciding, is this organization passing, the requirements? It's really the person who would be sending the funding, that entity that's making that decision. And for the most part, we're only working with donor agencies or with INGOs that would be, operating, if it's a context that has OFAC or other sanctions, they would be potentially have a humanitarian waiver that would allow them to navigate that a little bit more sort of nimbly. And then we do have a sort of monitoring and evaluation process that we can deploy later when needed. And actually, this is a sort of like plug for a talk that's happening tomorrow from our head of monitoring and evaluation, who's going to be talking about how you actually build those systems out. So it's really about establishing trust on both sides of the transaction.
Yeah, so maybe I'll tackle a little bit different part of David's question, which is about the blockers for donors, because that's something we come up a lot against when we're trying to kind of scale some of our open source technology that we're using. So I'd say the first thing with a lot of the big donors especially is that like they're a bit allergic to crypto in general, because of obviously we know, the kind of challenges over the past few years and decade with crypto and some of the kind of bad rap that it has. So I think one thing, and this is just like a little narrative, like terminology thing, because we're using stablecoin only in our work with humanitarian actors, so we're using primarily USDC, because obviously when you're working with humanitarian actors, you don't want to have challenges of like devaluation of currency or volatility, these kind of things. And in some cases, time is up. In some cases, you have devaluation issues where, like in Argentina, you're saving with USDC, you're saving quite a bit in terms of the devaluation and everything. But anyway, so we're using largely stablecoin, and so I think for us, we say we're using digital currency at the end of the day, right? So it's these like small terminology things that actually make a big difference. If we're saying, okay, we're using digital currency, these are digital currency solutions, right? Digital payment solutions is kind of how we're framing this with a lot of our large donors, because that's a lot easier to sell up the chain for them and politically for them. And then it's only when you dig in that you're like, oh, this is actually a blockchain solution, right? And I think from the side of the people that are using the technology, like a lot of the time what we see is they don't need to know how it works, right? Like ideally, like anyone can use our cell phone based like technology where we're using digital wallets to send digital currency in Ukraine and other places. Like we want an 80-year-old grandmother in Ukraine to be able to use it, right? So we're not hiding the fact that it's on the blockchain, but like that's not the primary thing that we're selling on both sides of the coin, either to the donors or to the people using the technology. So it like becomes a lot more accessible, and I think it takes away some of this like perceived risk as well. And I know we're out of time, but I just want to say one other thing. I think a lot of the thing we also see with like large donors too is even with large donors, which makes it a little bit difficult to scale for smaller organizations even, is that a lot of these solutions, obviously we have regulatory concerns in the different countries we work in, so we need to always be sure that digital currency is legal, so that's like one blocker, right? That we can't influence as much as we would like to, but of course we can advocate in all of these things. But I think there's a role for blockchain foundations and for other organizations to play in streamlining processes where there's like legal agreements in place. Like, so for instance, you know, an organization working with us would need to have an agreement in place with the off-ramp providers or the digital wallet, right? And if you're a small organization close to the ground, that's really difficult to have like these legal agreements in place for every off-ramp you want to use or every digital wallet you want to use. So I think this is even challenging for large organizations when they want to scale. Like they want to use a different wallet in Ukraine than they want to use in Argentina, right? So that means another legal agreement and another legal agreement with the off-ramp provider and these kind of things. So I think this is another challenging space that we need to help them overcome in order to be able to actually scale these solutions. Is like we need to support them in overcoming the legal environment, these kind of challenges as well, to enable not only the largest organizations in the world to kind of use this kind of technology. The end.
All right. So, thank you. All right. So yeah, speaking of blockchain foundations, here we go.
No, I think that was awesome. Like, let's give it up for them once more. You know, that was an incredible panel.